we need to notice that if we have intercepts, that's going to be where the graph does what? It intersects. All right, so it's going to be your x and y axis. So it's your x or y axis. Is that okay? Now, an x-intercept occurs where?
At the x-axis.
Okay, but what variable is 0 there? Which one? Is x 0 there or is y 0 there? Y is 0 there. Okay. Now, what about where the y-intercept? What is true about the x? X is 0. Awesome. So hopefully that's review for us. Now, looking at this, notice that a function, we're talking specifically about a function, you can have more than one 0 or more x-intercepts, but you can have only at most one y-intercept. So when we start solving these equations, if you come up with more than one y-intercept, something's wrong. So make sure we're clear on that. All right, so for the next few problems, I want y'all to look through these and list out your x and y intercepts. Y'all go through and list those right quick. Okay, so as you go along each one of these, you should be able to pick out your x and y intercepts from a graph. Now, whether you listed out just the number or you wrote out the ordered pair, since you are already identifying these values to be an x-intercept or a y-intercept, it would be fine just to write the numbers 4 and then 2. But that's only because it's been identified as an x or y-intercept. If it had not been identified and you just wrote a number, you would not receive credit because we're not sure what that number would imply. Don't know if you're talking about x equaling 2 being a vertical line or y equaling 4 being a horizontal line. So you have to be careful and pay attention to how the information is given to you. And again, it's quite possible for your graph to never touch the x or y axis. That's going to be true over here with this function, which is going to be the rational function 1 over x. So you have to be careful with those. Not every single graph or every single function is always going to touch the x or y axis. Do y'all have any questions about identifying your x or y intercept? Okay, so our next step, go through and talk about how to identify a 0 and then how to algebraically find the zeros. So if you're talking about the zeros of a function, you're talking about where the graph crosses the x or y axis. So it's either the point, and it could be a single point, or it could be more than one. So it's the point or points where your graph crosses. And which axis is it crossing? The x-axis. That's going to be the one identified as the zeros. Sometimes it's also called the roots. So the zeros of a function or the roots of a function, that's going to be the pointer points where the graph crosses the x-axis. Not the y-axis, but the x-axis. That's the zeros for the function. And then finding these zeros and the y-intercept algebraically, what you're going to have to do is set your function itself equal to 0, and you're going to solve for your variable x. So again, to find the zeros, you're going to set the entire function, all of f of x equal to 0, and solve for x. And then to find the y-intercepts, you're going to have to evaluate the function at 0. Because when x is 0, that's whenever you get a y-intercept. Okay, we're going to put that into use. Let's look over at our examples. On example 7, you are asked to find both the x and the y-intercepts. You're asked to find the zeros and the y-intercept. So your first step that you were told to do would be to set f of x equal to 0. So I'm going to sub in 0 for f of x, And that's going to be equal to negative absolute value of x minus 5, and then plus 3. Again, we're solving for x, so I'm going to add or subtract 3 over to the other side. So I have negative 3 equals negative absolute value of x minus 5. Those negatives would cancel each other out, or you divide by a negative 1 or multiply. So I have 3 equals the absolute value of x minus 5. Now from that, you need to set up 2 separate cases, because if you took the absolute value of something and got 3, your 2 options would be here that inside the absolute value was originally equal to 3. Or what else could this have been equal to? Negative 3. Awesome. So it had to have been one of those two, so we're going to have to set x minus 5 equal to both of those. And then we're going to add our 5 over, so x equals 8. And then over here, if we add 5 over, we get x to be 2. So our zeros for our function we found was going to be 8, 0. And then it is 2, 0. So there's the zeros for the function. And again, we start out, we set the function equal to 0 and solve for x. Now to find your y-intercept, that's going to be where we evaluate the function at 0. So we need to substitute in 0. So I'm going to have negative absolute value of 0 minus 5 plus 3. And let's see what all that's going to be equal to. Inside the absolute value, we're going to get a positive 5, aren't we? But the negative on the outside is going to make it back negative. So negative 5 plus 3 is going to be negative 2. So here my y-intercept is going to be 0, negative 2. Do y'all have any questions about those? Okay, let's try the next one. Try number 8. Again, same process. So again, we start out by letting our function equal 0. And so we're going to have 2x squared minus 7x minus 4. Now here you're going to have to factor this. A lot of people would try to add it 4 over and try to do something with that. That's not going to work for these. You're going to have to factor this. So you can either do trial and error or slide and divide, either one. I'm looking at this from slide and divide's point of view. You would multiply that 2 over. So we're going to have 0 equals x squared minus 7x minus 8. Then when you factor that, you are going to use the factors of 8 and 1. And then you need to come back and divide by 2 because that's what you slid over. So I have 0 equals x minus 4 because that 8 over 2 will reduce. And then I'm going to have over here, let's move that 2 up. So I'm going to have 2x plus 1. Questions about the factoring? Now you are more than welcome to factor this trial and error, and I'll do the next one with trial and error as well. But you're also welcome to do slide and divide. Now if we set each part equal to 0 and solve, notice we're going to get x to be 4. And over here on the other side, 2x plus 1 equal to 0. I'm going to subtract 1, and then I'm going to have to divide by 2. So I'm going to get negative 1/2. Is that okay? Questions about it? So our zeros down here that we found, that's going to be 4, 0. And then the other negative 1/2, 0. Now we need to find the y-intercepts, which means that we're going to substitute in or evaluate the function at 0. So that's going to give me 2 times 0 squared minus 7 times 0 minus 4. So what is all that going to be equal to? Okay, looks like we're going to end up with -4, isn't it? Okay, so let's go ahead and write in our y-intercept. That means that we're going to have 0, -4. All right, so for number 9, we're finding our zeros again. So we're going to have 0 equals x to the 4th minus 5x squared plus 4. Now, we don't have a GCF here. We can't factor out any part of those x's. We're going to have to factor with them. So what are we going to put inside our parentheses to take care of that? Perfect. It's going to be x squared, isn't it? Is that okay? All right, so what factors of 4 can I multiply together, take those and add, and get -5? -1 and -4, isn't it? Now, there's 2 options from this. You can either factor this again because it is the difference of 2 squares. Did anybody factor it again?
I was going to, but I didn't think that was right.
No, it is right. As long as there's a minus sign between the squares, it's perfectly okay. So if we factor this again, we get x minus 1 times x plus 1. And then over on the other side, -2 and +2, isn't it? How many zeros are we going to get from all that? We're going to have 4 zeros, aren't we? So down through here, when we start listing those out, we're going to have -1 0. We're going to have +1 0. We're going to have 2 0. And what's going to be the other one? -2 0. Now, is that the only way you could have solved this? Not really, because right here we could have set both parts equal to 0 and solved it that way, couldn't we? So we could have done this, and we could have added our 1 over, so we had x squared equals 1 and x squared equals 4. And we could have taken the square root of both sides. It's just, if you do that, please remember to do plus or minus 1, and over here, plus or minus 2. That way, you don't lose any of your answers. A lot of times when kids choose to do this part here, they lose half of their answers because they lose the negative part. All right, what about your y-intercepts? If we evaluate this function at 0, what is that going to give us? It's just going to be 4, isn't it? So my y-intercept is going to be at 0, 4. Do y'all have any questions about 9?
What did you multiply or add that to get to?
For the y-intercept, what we're going to end up doing, let every x that you see be 0. So f at 0 is going to be 0 to the 4th minus 5 times 0 squared plus 4. So notice how all the terms that have an x in it really just go away. So all that you're left with is that 4. Is that okay? All right, let's go ahead and get started on number 10. How do...
0 squared is what 0 squared is 1.
I'm sorry?
All we want. 0 times 0 is 0. Yeah, but there's something like...
Okay, so let's look at number 10. Okay, starting out, we're putting a 0. So 0 equals x cubed minus 6x squared minus 7x. What's our first step with factoring? GCF. So then that leaves me with x squared minus 6x minus 7. Is that okay? Okay, what about inside the parentheses? We're going to have to factor that. 7 and what? Positive 1. Now, we need to set each part equal to 0 and solve. So that means x has to be set equal to 0 because it's sitting right out here. It's part of the factors. X minus 7 equals 0. And x plus 1 equals 0. So if we solve this, this one's finished. Over here, x equals 7. And over here, x equals -1. So our zeros that we just found should be 0, 0, 7, 0, and -1, 0. Okay, what about your y-intercept? Let's go solve that. So we're going to look at f at 0. So if I let x be 0 everywhere that I see, what's going to be your function's value? 0. So your y-intercept for this is 0, 0. All right, so what's your first step here? After we let our function be 0, what are we going to have to factor out of each term? You're going to have to factor out an x. Awesome. So you do have that GCF. So we're going to have 0 equals x times 3x squared plus 13x minus 10. Is that okay? So far, so good. Did y'all slide and divide with this? Okay, so let's see what we can do with it. X squared plus 13x minus 30. Did y'all get 30? Now, here's the problem. Look at your factors. Everybody uses 10 and 3, but 10 and 3 is not the right factors, because you need to subtract and get 13. You can't subtract 10 and 3 and get 13. Is that where we missed it?
I used 15 and 10.
Oh, well, dang. Let's look. All right, so that's going to be x plus 15, right? And x minus 2. Now, what did we slide over? 3. So that's what we've got to divide by. So when all of this is said and done, the factored form should be x times x plus 5 times, now where's that 3 going to go since it doesn't reduce anymore? So it's going to be 3x minus 2, isn't it? Okay, have y'all found your mistakes? Oh my. All right, so let's see. If we're setting each part equal to 0, we're going to have x equals 0, right? Since it's a variable out there, you have to incorporate it. You have x plus 5 equals 0, so that means x is -5. And then we have 3x minus 2 equal to 0. So I would add my 2 over and then divide by 3. So there's the zeros for it. So we have 0, 0. We have -5, 0. And finally 2/3, 0. Is that okay? What about your y-intercept? If I let x be a 0, what's going to be the function's value? 0. So it's going to be 0, 0. Questions about it? Got it?
Yeah, we forgot to divide.
That always happens. So again, starting off, we need to, let's see. What are we got to start with our 0, don't we? Square root of x plus 1 minus 2. What are we going to do with that minus 2? We're going to have to add that over, so we have the square root of x plus 1. How do I get rid of the square root? Square both sides. Let's square both sides. Y'all knew that, didn't you? So 4 equals x plus 1. And so how do we solve for x? Subtract the 1 over, and we're going to get 3. So x equals 3, doesn't it? Yep. So here are zeros for this one. We're going to have 3, 0. But now we need to evaluate our function at 0 to get our y-intercept. So we're going to have the square root of 0 plus 1, then minus 2. So what is that going to be equal to? What's the square root of 1? 1. What's 1 minus 2? -1. So my y-intercept is 0, -1.